That's not a knife. This is a knife. Let's talk about messers. Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So since I a few weeks ago talked about the fact that I had some of Todd's stuff, link below as always, in my house, I quickly showed this and lots of people wanted me to talk more about it. That's what I'm now going to do, but I'm going to talk in a couple of different videos actually about the Langmesser or long knife and a few different aspects of the weapon in history, as well as sort of reviewing this specific one made by Todd, of Todd stuff. So the first thing is, let's dispense with the scabbard, because I'm not going to start with a specific review of this object as such. The first thing to say is that what is a Langmesser? Well, Messer simply means knife in German. Okay, the reason, almost certainly, probably, that it was called a Messer or a Langmesser in German is that it has a construction of the hilt that is very similar to a knife, and in fact they do come in a variety of sizes. This is a relatively large one, you know, it's a sword-sized one, but you do find so-called peasant knives, or Beyenvar I think they're pronounced, in the Low Countries, which are essentially like a smaller version of this, almost a bit like an Afghan Khyber knife or chura, but this type has very much a sort of falchion type blade. Now at that point I'm going to talk a little bit about falchions. Now I realise that Shad and other people have done other videos talking about this subject in more depth than I'm intending to go into here, but nevertheless what I'm holding above is a reproduction of, by Paul Binns in this case, a reproduction of a 13th century style of falchion. What we have below here is a reproduction of a 15th century style of Langmesser. Now clearly they are different blade types, but in actual fact we do find falchions in the 14th and 15th century which have blades very much like this. So were they really different weapons? Well, without beating around the bush too much, I think in a way, no. Fundamentally, the way that you apply a sword in this case, or any weapon, to an opponent is very much dependent on basic characteristics. How long is it? How does it thrust or cut relative to each other? How does it balance? How much does it weigh? These kind of basic physical characteristics. And actually, in terms of what the actual basic physical characteristics of this Langmesser compared to a 14th century falchion, is there a big difference? No, not really. I would go as far as to say that basically the Langmesser in this case is a sort of civilianized version of the falchion. And in fact the Langmesser doesn't really start to come around in common use in Germany. It is specifically a Germanic, shall we say, style of sidearm, although there were comparable styles of sidearm in other countries, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But this type of weapon doesn't really seem to appear until about the year 1400. So therefore falchions had been around, you know, falchions with sword hilts, we notice, so they have a pommel, a crossguard and a grip wedged between those two elements, compared to the Langmesser, which has a handle constructed with a full width tang and scales, grip scales, like a Bowie knife with rivets going through. This type of construction doesn't really appear until on this type of blade until about the year 1400. And in fact, if we look at the fencing treatises, which start to appear around the year 1400, we see this weapon start to appear in those treatises really in the 15th century. I think, off the top of my head, the earliest dated element of a treatise to show the use of the Langmesser, in this case quite a big one, is Codex Wallenstein. But if we look at Lecuckner and the other classic kind of examples, Talhofer of course, the classic examples of the Langmesser in use in treatises, we're really looking at the middle of the 15th century. So probably the early 1400s up to the middle of the 1400s were really when this weapon started to become popular. Now I'm sure there were lots of social conditions behind that, and why did this particular style of sword become popular at that time? I don't have the knowledge to go into that, so I'm going to avoid that topic completely, but I'm sure there are other people out there who can talk about this topic in more depth, and it would be very interesting to know, why does this sword appear at that time? But in terms of the actual blade, and coming back to the basic physical characteristics, this style of blade, this kind of length, this thickness, this general kind of weight and balance, the shape of it with this clipped back point that's essentially like a giant bowie knife, isn't it? It's like a giant oversized bowie knife. This type of blade does absolutely appear in the 14th century, very commonly so, and very usually on sword type hilts. So this blade married to this hilt would be quite common to find in 14th century art and surviving examples. If you look at the 14th century manuscript that dates to about 1340, I think it's dated 1338 to 1344, called The Romance of Alexander. Anybody who likes 14th century armour loves this book, because it shows really interesting elements of transitional armour at the period when the coat of plates was prevalent and plate armour was becoming more common in the 1340s. But if you look in the Romance of Alexander, for example, we see a whole buttload of these falchions in use. You can also see them in things like the Holcomb Picture Bible and various absolutely loads of 14th century manuscripts. Now, if we think about when this blade came around, so I've talked about this heavy chopping style of blade, and my theory is that this was essentially used against relatively lightly armoured, or in some cases unarmoured, levy opponents for the most part. Okay, so common soldiers. This is not going to be a particularly effective weapon at all against people wearing plate armour. In fact, it would be a very inefficient weapon to use against people in plate armour, because it doesn't perform well as a mace. So you're not going to create a huge amount of impact. It's not a heavy weapon. It only weighs 3 pounds. It's only the same weight as a sort of relatively chunky arming sword. It's not heavy. It's just that you've got this width focused at the end and a very, very thin and fine edge. So it's great for carving up flesh, great for chopping through things like gambesons and stuff, but it's not good for hitting against armour. But of course, once we get into the 14th century, we have more and more soldiers wearing more and more effective types of armour. Plate armour is starting to become more common. Mail is, or rather soldiers wearing mail are probably more common, because in the 14th century, what do we see? We start to see the rise of a greater degree of professionalised soldiery, common soldiers. In England, famously, we see the rise of the longbowmen. In Genoa, we see the rise of crossbowmen. In Switzerland, we see the rise of pikemen. All over Europe, we start to see better equipped, probably better trained, more professionalised. They weren't full-time. We mustn't think of them as professional soldiers in the modern sense, but more professional, a greater degree of professionalism, more professional soldiers of common ranks, shall we say, like you and I, or most of you, and definitely I, common people, not nobility. And in that context, if the majority of your opponents are now wearing a better degree of armour, clearly the point is going to be important. So what we start to see are falchion blades that are like this, that have clipped back points, that now, yes, now absolutely, in close, I can half sword with this. I can, at distance, jam this into people's armpits, or through visor slits, or into the backs of their knees, or insides of their elbows. All these places you get gaps with armour. And indeed, if they're wearing mail over a gambeson, I can jam the point into this. Yes, I can still cut effectively with this weapon. I can still cut unarmoured faces and hands and legs and this kind of stuff. But if someone's wearing a mail shirt over a gambeson, I've got the option to jam my point through it. For this reason, the points on these weapons are often quite robust, quite tough, because they have to be. That's what the point was for. Think about rundle daggers here. I'm not saying that they were all as robust as a rundle dagger point, but they were very often beefy points. They aren't fine, really thin, fine points that are going to get damaged too easily. But by having the clipped back, you retain a certain degree of mass towards the tip and a shape of edge, which means that this weapon is still very effective at cutting nearer the tip, like a towa or a saber or a katana. It has the same theory, essentially, and it means that your centre of percussion is further away from your hands. The weapon can afford to be in total length shorter, but you can still reach someone from a decent distance away. The long and pointy blades, type 15s, type 18s, things like this, the centre of percussion as a percentage or a fraction of the length of the blade is, relatively speaking, closer to your hand. So actually a longer blade of a long pointy type blade might actually only have a centre of percussion which is the same as this shorter blade. So this type of blade became popular in the 14th century and was very seems, according to art and according to some surviving examples we've got, seems to have been very, very popular. One little detail I'll just throw in here. So any of you who watch David Rawlings' channel, London Longsword, will see that he has a falchion of a 14th century type, I would say, that has a similar shape to this, but the edge is on the inside. And this is paralleled by an example in the Musée de l'Armée in des Invalides in Paris. And it is interesting to note that actually, if you think about this, if you think about what this shape is for, you've got this chopping portion of the blade up here, but a narrowed point. In actual fact, it doesn't matter which side you're cutting with, but these are single-edged swords. So some people prefer to have the edge on this side and here, and some people prefer to have the edge on this side. Now, I would say, based on looking at manuscript art, usually in art, we see people striking with the curved edge, essentially the saber edge. So it does seem that most examples did cut with this edge, but some examples were edged on this side, and you know, there are strengths and weaknesses to those 2 points. You'll get more of a slicing cut, obviously, with the curved edge here, and more of a chopping cookery type axe-like cut with that edge. So, you know, advantages to each. It's just a matter of personal preference, but actually overall the overall effect is kind of the same. You've essentially got mass towards the tip, so it's good at cutting and centre of percussion far from the hand, but still has a pointy tip for thrusting through armour. So the end result is actually, relatively speaking, quite similar. So this type of blade, popular in the 14th century, and then in the 15th century we start to see, again perhaps because of social conditions, social reasons, particularly in Germanic countries and the Low Countries. So this style of hilt particularly popular in what's now Germany. Remember, Germany wasn't a country at the time. There were just different states that essentially later were unified into Germany in the 19th century. But what we now call Germany, Austria, much of what's now Poland, what's now the Czech Republic was then Bohemia, part of the Netherlands, probably part of Belgium, and probably part of France, the sort of Germanic influenced part of France, Alsace-Lorraine and so on. So there's this kind of what I would describe as the Germanic influenced region, where for whatever reasons, cultural, legal, economic reasons, this style of hilt that's essentially like a bowie knife hilt, it's actually a knife hilt. You think about how a lot of kitchen knives, carving knives, are made with a full width tang and with slab grips on either side, sometimes, not always, sometimes with the addition of a pommel on there. And then with some form of guard. And some of these, you'll see this doesn't have a particularly big guard. Some of them have long guards, some of them have virtually no guard at all. So again, down to personal preference. And it is a knife hilt, and that's why these are known as Langmesser, long knives. But the blade is very much a falchion blade. And is there any real difference between this blade and a 14th century falchion? No, I wouldn't say so, not in use. But what the hilt tells us is in the 14th century, the falchion was seen mostly as a soldier, as a knightly weapon, and very often shown in the hands of what we would describe as knights or men-at-arms, people in armour. In the 15th century, it's a different kettle of fish. We start to see swords like this, slightly scaled down, a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, a little bit more convenient and easy to carry, often with forms of knife hilt being carried by lower class soldiers, people like gunners, halberdiers, crossbowmen, this type of thing. And you know, that what we would, perhaps some people would describe, a lot of them would have been burghers, they would have been the town class. Many of them would have been fairly affluent, but they weren't aristocracy for the most part. Now, that's not to say that aristocracy didn't also use these hilts. They did. In fact, we have messers that belong to the Emperor Maximilian which still survive. So emperors and kings also then thought, that looks really cool, I'm going to emulate this style of hilt, sometimes with a long, with a so-called Kriegsmesser or Grossmesser, with a longsword length hilt applied to it sometimes, and sometimes a one-handed length hilt. So by the 15th century, and certainly by the end of the 15th century, so we're talking about the 1490s and 1500, we start to see this style of hilt, sometimes on very high status swords, but that seems to have been a fashion that caught on. It seems that this style of hilt had its origins in the more humble knife carried by more humble soldiers. But as mentioned, that doesn't mean they're poor, that just means that they're not necessarily the top echelons of society. So that's a brief introduction to the Langmesser. The one thing I will say is, so I've talked about German areas and how this is essentially a German weapon. But we do find parallel, similar swords in other regions. And an example in England, I'll just use England as an example because it's the one I know the best. We have a weapon which in 15th century sources that I've discovered was called a hanger. Now, many of you will remember that I'll just grab one here, in later uses, this is a hanger. Now let's just have a little think about that for a second. If this in England in 15th century would have been called a hanger, is it really that different to what in the 18th century or 17th century would have been called a hanger in England? No, not really. We've got a knuckle bow, and that's about it. You've essentially got a hilt with a form of crossguard that's not particularly complex for the most part, and then it's a short sabre falchion type blade. So in actual fact, this type of weapon goes, you could argue, from its roots in the 14th century all the way through to ultimately the 19th century still being in use. And this is one of the reasons when people ask me about the origins of sabres in Western Europe, for example, it's a very difficult question to answer, because whilst there were sabres that originated from Turkish and Mongol people from before 1000 AD, in Charlemagne's time, the Avars were using sabres, for example. Whilst there were sabres from that time, it seems that actually there was almost an indigenous tradition of types of single-edged cut and thrust swords in Europe. And in England, for example, we have the hanger, which seems to have been around since at least the 14th, 15th century, and although it evolved slightly in appearance, as a fundamental type of weapon was still around in the 19th century. And I think that that is related also to these Langmessers as well. How do we say that, how different is this really to a sabre? Well, it's shorter, we can say that, it's shorter and broader. But falchions, sabres, Langmessers, hangers, they're very much related, and very often directly, visibly related as well. If we look at the Swiss sabre, as many people call it, it's a relative of the longsword, it's also a relative of the messer, it's a relative of the sabre. It's not always clear cut to say this type of sword came from there to there, and that's how it, sometimes the evolution of these weapons affect each other. Now, one final thing I'll say, so how to identify a Langmesser, it's essentially a falchion blade or a hanger blade or a short sabre blade. The blades can vary, okay? The hilt is made like a knife, as I've mentioned already, but there is one feature which is particular. It's not unique, it's not quite unique, but it is particular to the Langmesser, and it is this. Okay, it's the lug that sticks out the side there. Now, we do find these on small knives as well. It seems actually that perhaps it originated on smaller knives, so-called benvar, I don't know how to pronounce it, but peasant knives I think it translates as, or people's knife, folk knife, where they actually have that side lug, but they don't have crossguard quillons. And it seems like with those knives, it was possibly originally a device to prevent, if you were stabbing something or someone, to prevent your hand from slipping up onto the blade. So a knife, a weapon where you don't necessarily need a crossguard, you think, well, if I have something sticking out the side, then I no longer run any risk when I'm stabbing someone to death of my hand sliding up onto the blade and cutting my own hand. It seems probable that that's where they originated. But then by the 15th century, they're appearing on these sword size or short sword sized Langmessers, long knives, and there they perform an additional protective function. Number one, if you're just using the Langmesser in a conventional way, they provide additional side protection, a little bit, not an awful lot, but a little bit of extra side protection to the hand, a bit like later side rings. But additionally to that, we even see in the techniques of the Langmesser, for example in Lecoq's treatise, and in all of them basically, showing the use of the Langmesser in any kind of detail, we see sometimes the use of the flat of the blade to defend. Now, I've talked about edge and flat a long time ago. I'll probably talk a little bit more about edge and flat in the future. The general rule in medieval swordsmanship seems to be that most defensive actions were done with the edge of your blade into some portion of the opponent's blade. Sometimes it would hit obliquely edge on edge, sometimes it would hit your edge into their flat. There are not that many actions that we can find in medieval and Renaissance treatises where you specifically use the flat of your blade, but in at least a couple of these Langmesser fencing treatises, they tell you specifically, because it's different to normal, they tell you, and for this technique, use the flat of your blade to catch the opponent's blade blow on the flat. Now, the Nagel is absolutely critical to doing this. If you don't have the Nagel, what would happen if that wasn't there? The blade would slide down and chop my knuckles off, okay, which clearly is not a very good thing to do. So having that additional lug, it's essentially like another quillon, it's like another guard sticking out sideways, enables binding and blade actions that you can't usually do with a normal cross-hilted sword. And that is very particular and peculiar to German Langmessers like this. But interestingly, we find a slight parallel on English hangers of the 15th century, but they took it a step further. Rather than it just being a little lug on the side, we actually find late 15th century examples where it's an entire bar going all the way around the side, and they have a knuckle bow as well. So in Britain, for whatever reason, even in the 15th century, we're talking about like 1480, so kind of late Wars of the Roses, we're already starting to see a knuckle bow and a sidebar, kind of like sabres. So we're starting to see almost what we think of as a later period of hilt developing in the Middle Ages, bam, right in the 15th century, not even the 16th century, but in the 15th century. But in Germany, this was the conventional style of Langmesser hilt. Knife hilt, Nagel, short guard. So there we go, that is an introduction to the Langmesser, this example made by Todd of Todd Stuff, link below. And this is a fairly typical size and example of the type. What's it particularly good at? It's particularly good at chopping and thrusting and all sorts of things. It's a very versatile sword. It's not, I wouldn't describe it as a specialised sword. It is a general, all-purpose fighting sword that's good at cutting, good at thrusting, easy to carry around, and it's a great little weapon, and I can see why they were popular. And don't ever underestimate how important it is for something to look cool, because just as we like things that look cool now, they liked things that looked cool to them in the 15th century as well. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.